The brutal theater of the Western Front in the early 20th century was defined by stagnation, industrial slaughter, and the horrifying reality of trench warfare. Artillery barrages churned the earth into a toxic quagmire of mud and blood, while machine guns created impenetrable walls of flying lead. Amidst this chaotic devastation, a different, more silent form of psychological terror began to take root across the devastated landscape. It was the birth of the modern sniper, a solitary predator operating in the grey zones of no man's land, fundamentally altering the geometry of death. Before the American expeditionary forces arrived in Europe, the Imperial German Army held a distinct advantage in the grim discipline of sharpshooting. Equipped with the formidable Mauser-Gewehr 98, German marksmen systematically eliminated unwary Allied soldiers who carelessly exposed themselves above the parapets. These elite hunters established a terrifying dominance over the scarred terrain, instilling a deep sense of paralyzing fear among British and French troops. The battlefields were meticulously divided into calculated kill zones, where even a momentary lapse in absolute vigilance resulted in an immediate, fatal strike from an unseen German adversary. The tactical landscape shifted dramatically with the large-scale deployment of American forces, bringing a completely new element of lethal precision to the stagnant trenches. The United States military introduced the Springfield Model 1903, a bolt-action marvel that would quickly earn a fearsome reputation among enemy combatants. Originally developed after analyzing the harsh lessons learned during the Spanish-American War, this rifle was a masterpiece of lethal engineering and metallurgical advancement. It was specifically designed to deliver unparalleled accuracy at extreme ranges, transforming the standard infantryman into a potentially devastating instrument of long-range destruction. Ironically, the fundamental design of the Springfield rifle borrowed heavily from the very Mauser actions utilized by the German forces, leading to patent infringement disputes before the war. However, American engineers meticulously refined the underlying mechanics, creating an exceptionally smooth, highly reliable action that performed flawlessly in atrocious battlefield conditions. The action allowed for rapid, fluid cycling of cartridges without requiring the shooter to break their crucial line of sight. This critical mechanical superiority granted American marksmen the unique ability to deliver devastatingly accurate follow-up shots with terrifying, calculated speed and mechanical precision. The true dark heart of the Springfield's terrifying capability was the devastating 30-06 Springfield cartridge, officially adopted by the military in 1906. Firing a Spitzer bullet featuring a highly aerodynamic pointed nose, the projectile achieved incredible supersonic velocities that drastically altered long-range ballistics. This advanced aerodynamic design essentially flattened the bullet's trajectory over vast distances, significantly reducing the complex mathematical estimations typically required for bullet drop. The immense kinetic energy carried by the 30-06 round ensured that any impact, regardless of the distance, resulted in catastrophic, immediately fatal physiological trauma to the human target. Beyond its sheer destructive power, the remarkable ballistic coefficient of the 30-06 projectile provided exceptional resistance to unpredictable crosswinds across the desolate battlefields. In the erratic, swirling breezes of no man's land, where traditional rounds would drift significantly off target, the Springfield's bullet maintained a terrifyingly true flight path. This inherent aerodynamic stability allowed American snipers to consistently secure lethal hits at ranges previously considered entirely impossible by contemporary military standards. The absolute predictability of the bullet's flight mechanics systematically dismantled the perceived safety parameters that enemy forces had carefully established over years of combat. To fully harness the immense ballistic potential of the Springfield, elite marksmen were equipped with the highly specialized Warner and Swayze telescopic sight. This ungainly, heavy optical instrument, mounted distinctively on the left side of the rifle's receiver, magnified the distant horrors of the battlefield with chilling clarity. Despite its somewhat fragile nature and susceptibility to moisture, in the hands of a disciplined operator, the optic transformed the rifle into an instrument of surgical execution. The crosshairs allowed shooters to identify microscopic vulnerabilities in enemy defenses, turning tiny gaps in sandbags into absolute death traps. The combination of the Springfield rifle, the 30-06 cartridge, and the Warner and Swayze optic created a weapon system that transcended standard infantry warfare. It was no longer merely a tool for suppressing enemy trenches. it became a sophisticated mechanism for inflicting profound psychological trauma upon the opposing forces. The mathematical precision of the weapon stripped away the random nature of combat casualties, replacing the chaos of artillery fire with the cold, calculated certainty of an executioner. Enemy soldiers soon realized that they were not merely fighting an army, but facing a relentless, invisible predator. The effectiveness of this terrifying mechanical apparatus was heavily amplified by the rigorous, unyielding marksmanship training instilled in the United States Marine Corps. Men like Corporal Thomas Hayes were thoroughly indoctrinated into a harsh culture of absolute trigger control, measured breathing, and unparalleled patience. They were trained to view their rifles not as mere tools, but as direct extensions of their own physical forms, capable of reaching out across the deadly void to deliver immediate death. This cultural emphasis on individual precision stood in stark contrast to the European doctrine of massed, generalized volley fire. Prior to the Springfield's devastating debut, German sentries and officers had established a comfortable understanding of effective engagement distances along the scarred front lines. They firmly believed that remaining beyond 600 yards provided a virtually impenetrable shield against targeted small arms fire, allowing them to operate with relative impunity. Officers would carelessly smoke cigarettes, and artillery spotters would brazenly scan the horizon, confident in the protective barrier of sheer distance. The arrival of the American sniper fundamentally shattered this deep-seated illusion, transforming these established sanctuaries into highly active, exceptionally lethal execution zones without any warning. The initial encounters with the Springfield's devastating reach sent terrible shockwaves of panic throughout the entire Imperial German command structure. Reports began flooding in, detailing veteran officers being instantly killed while standing well behind what were officially designated as secure secondary trench lines. A German captain, previously observing the desolate landscape from an assumed safe distance of 800 yards, was reportedly struck precisely through the center of his skull. Such localized events were initially dismissed as incredibly unlucky stray bullets, but the mathematical frequency of these impossible shots quickly revealed a much darker, systematic reality. The most profound psychological terror stemmed directly from the supersonic velocity of the devastating 3006 projectile slicing through the cold air. Because the bullet traveled significantly faster than the speed of sound, the lethal projectile physically struck its target long before the distinct acoustic crack of the rifle's discharge could reach the trench. A soldier would suddenly collapse backward, his life violently extinguished, followed a fraction of a second later by the distant, mocking report of the weapon. This horrifying sensory disconnect meant that the dead literally never heard the shot that abruptly ended their existence. This eerie phenomenon birthed an atmosphere of suffocating paranoia that rapidly infected the minds of the previously confident German infantrymen. The terrifying realization that death could materialize completely without acoustic warning completely eroded the psychological resilience of the frontline troops stationed in the mud. Veterans who had bravely withstood massive, earth-shattering artillery barrages found themselves violently trembling at the prospect of merely looking through a heavily fortified periscope. The American snipers, utilizing the unparalleled accuracy of the Springfield, were systematically assassinating the enemy's morale. One precisely calculated, silent impact at a time across the bloody front. For marksmen like Corporal Hayes, the grim task of long-range execution was stripped of all emotion, reduced entirely to cold mathematical equations. He would lie absolutely motionless in the decaying mud for agonizing hours, carefully documenting wind speeds, barometric pressure, and minute shifts in the glaring sunlight. His Springfield rifle became a specialized scientific instrument, utilized to violently cancel out a specific human variable existing in the opposing trench network. This frightening level of clinical detachment allowed the American snipers to consistently maintain their terrifying efficiency, completely unaffected by the inherent horror of their grim daily profession. Despite the flawless mechanical superiority of the weapon, operating the Springfield effectively in a sniper capacity exacted a massive physical toll. The immense recoil of the heavy 3006 cartridge continually battered the shooter's shoulder, while the prolonged periods of absolute immobility in freezing mud degraded their physical health. Yet, this localized physical suffering paled in comparison to the immense psychological torment inflicted upon the heavily fortified German positions across the blasted fields. The relentless pressure of being constantly hunted by a mathematically perfect weapon began to severely degrade the operational efficiency of entire enemy battalions. In a desperate attempt to counter this new invisible threat, German commanders were forced to drastically alter their established trench warfare procedures. Communication trenches were dug significantly deeper, periscopes were strictly rationed, and any unnecessary movement during daylight hours was harshly punished by commanding officers. The simple act of transporting crucial daily rations to the forward lines became a terrifying, high-stakes gamble against the watchful optics of the American marksmen. The Springfield had effectively paralyzed the logistical movements of the enemy, utilizing sheer terror as an incredibly effective tactical barrier against the vast German military machine. As the horrifying death toll steadily mounted, dark rumors began rapidly circulating among the exhausted, terrified German conscripts huddled in their dugouts. They spoke in hushed, trembling whispers of a supernatural American demon, a phantom entity capable of bending the very trajectory of bullets through sheer malice. They believed no ordinary weapon could consistently achieve such nightmarish accuracy at ranges that rendered the shooter entirely invisible to the naked human eye. The Springfield had transcended its physical components of wood and steel, evolving into an imposing mythological entity of pure, inescapable doom in the enemy's collective consciousness. The Imperial German High Command, typically heavily reliant on cold statistics and broad strategic maneuvers, could no longer ignore the psychological crisis unfolding. The localized intelligence reports detailing the devastating efficiency of the American marksmen, utilizing the Springfield 1903, demanded an immediate, specialized countermeasure. They realized that standard infantry tactics were completely useless against an enemy that could surgically decapitate command structures from nearly a mile away. To restore order and break the paralyzing grip of terror, they needed to deploy a counter-predator capable of neutralizing the American threat. Hiding in the vast, desolate gray zone, this desperate strategic necessity set the grim stage for one of the most intense, psychologically draining sniper engagements in modern military history. The Germans would soon deploy their absolute finest sharpshooter, Unteroffizier Erich Voss, armed with a specialized Mauser, to hunt down the source of the American terror. The upcoming confrontation would severely test the theoretical limits of both the renowned Mauser action and the mathematically devastating Springfield 1903. The devastated fields of the Western Front were about to host a horrifying masterclass in lethal precision, where the absolute smallest mechanical error would guarantee a violent, instant death. As the dark storm clouds gathered over the brutally scarred landscape, the Springfield 1903 rested silently in the muddy American trenches. It was an exceptionally beautiful piece of industrial machinery, featuring polished walnut and heavily blued steel, harboring an immense, terrifying capacity for focused violence. Its flawlessly engineered anatomy was specifically designed for a single, terrifying purpose: to deliver instantaneous death across unfathomable distances without any warning. This mechanical perfection, combined with the cold discipline of the American marksman, forever altered the grim psychological landscape of warfare, cementing its dark legacy as the ultimate widowmaker. The terrifying consistency of the Springfield weapon system heavily relied on the meticulous, almost religious maintenance routines performed by the dedicated American snipers. In an environment completely saturated with highly corrosive elements, toxic chemical gases, and abrasive mud, protecting the intricate mechanical action was an absolute necessity. Men like Hayes would obsessively clean their rifle barrels, ensuring that no microscopic debris could potentially alter the perfect spiraling flight of the devastating projectile. This profound dedication to mechanical preservation ensured that when the critical moment of execution arrived, the weapon would perform its dark task with absolute mathematical certainty. Ultimately, the dark anatomy of the Springfield 1903 represented a frightening pinnacle of early 20th century lethal engineering and aggressive military innovation. It fundamentally transformed the scattered, chaotic nature of trench warfare into a highly calculated, terrifyingly silent environment of systematic, long-range assassination. The rifle effectively weaponized the very concepts of distance and acoustics, turning the vast expanse of the European battlefield into an inescapable psychological prison for the enemy. The terrifying legend of the weapon was now firmly established in blood, setting a chilling precedent for the agonizing, high-stakes sniper duels that would inevitably follow in the trenches. The haunting expanse of Belleau Wood presented a fundamentally different tactical nightmare compared to the stagnant mud of the standard trench lines. This dense, tangled forest was a chaotic labyrinth of shattered timber, deep ravines, and suffocating foliage that heavily obscured traditional lines of sight. For the deeply entrenched German forces, the thick woods initially offered a comforting illusion of impenetrable natural armor against direct enemy observation. They mistakenly believed that the dense vegetation would effectively neutralize the long-range capabilities of any approaching infantry, rendering surgical strikes practically impossible within the shadowy, broken terrain. Into this claustrophobic woodland theater stepped United States Marine Corporal Thomas Hayes, clutching his meticulously customized Springfield 1903 rifle. The weapon, equipped with the bulky but incredibly precise Warner and Swayze telescopic sight, was heavily wrapped in strips of burlap to break up its distinctive mechanical silhouette. Hayes moved with a predatory silence, perfectly blending into the rotting underbrush while constantly analyzing the complex environment for shifting wind currents. He understood that this chaotic environment required a masterful application of ballistics to successfully thread a supersonic projectile through the incredibly narrow gaps in the dense forest canopy. The German infantrymen, stationed within the deeper sections of Belleau Wood, had developed a fatal sense of complacency regarding their personal safety. Because traditional artillery fire was often absorbed or deflected by the massive tree trunks, they felt reasonably secure, moving openly behind their forward outposts. Officers routinely conducted tactical briefings in small clearings, while artillery spotters confidently perched in the upper branches of ancient oaks without attempting to camouflage their silhouettes. They fundamentally underestimated the profound technological leap represented by the American sniper weapon system, a miscalculation that would soon be measured entirely in blood. The terrifying introduction of the Springfield occurred on a remarkably quiet Tuesday morning when a high-ranking German artillery spotter climbed a prominent oak. From his elevated vantage point, nearly 800 yards away from the nearest American position, he began systematically mapping the opposing trench network. Corporal Hayes, perfectly concealed beneath a decaying log, smoothly calculated the minute elevation adjustments required for the massive distance and the slight updraft. "The wind is holding steady," Hayes whispered to himself, gently squeezing the trigger and sending the devastating 30-06 projectile directly through the spotter's optical binoculars. The sudden, violent death of the spotter sent an immediate shockwave of sheer panic rippling through the previously relaxed German command structure. The victim simply tumbled from the high branches without a single warning sound, striking the forest floor with a heavy, lifeless thud before the distant rifle crack echoed. The inspecting medical officer was utterly baffled by the horrific, localized trauma, noting that the sheer kinetic energy of the impact was completely inconsistent with standard stray bullets. This unprecedented event brutally shattered the established illusion of safety, instantly transforming the quiet woods into a terrifying slaughterhouse. The exceptionally flat trajectory of the Springfield Spitzer bullet was the critical mechanical factor that enabled such horrifying precision within the cluttered woods. Traditional projectiles, fired from comparable rifles, would require a significant, arching flight path over that massive distance, often striking intervening branches. However, the aerodynamic superiority of the American round allowed Hayes to punch through microscopic openings in the dense foliage with a terrifying, laser-like directness. This unique ballistic characteristic effectively turned the seemingly protective forest into a deadly, transparent glass house for the heavily armed American predator patiently waiting in the shadows. A particularly chilling anecdote regarding the weapon's lethal precision involved a veteran German captain directing defensive fortifications well behind the primary engagement line. Assuming complete immunity at a distance exceeding 900 yards, the officer paused his critical duties to casually light a fresh cigarette. The brief, glowing flare of the match provided an agonizingly perfect aiming point for Hayes, who was scanning the gloomy horizon through his specialized optic. The heavy projectile instantly extinguished the tiny flame, along with the officer's life, leaving the surrounding soldiers completely paralyzed by the inexplicable, sudden decapitation of their commander. The acoustic phenomenon associated with the supersonic 3006 cartridge earned the Springfield the terrifying moniker of the whispering death among the enemy ranks. Because the heavy bullet traveled significantly faster than the speed of sound, the deadly projectile always arrived well before the concussive report of the muzzle blast. A soldier would abruptly collapse, his skull violently shattered, and only seconds later would his terrified comrades hear the distant, mocking crack of the rifle. This horrifying delay meant that the victims literally never perceived the specific mechanical sound of the weapon that abruptly ended their mortal existence. Maintaining this level of terrifying operational effectiveness required Hayes to strictly adhere to a brutal, physically exhausting daily routine of absolute stillness. He would crawl into his carefully prepared firing position hours before sunrise, enduring freezing temperatures, biting insects, and severe muscle cramps without making a single sound. His Springfield rifle was treated with an almost religious reverence, continuously protected from the pervasive moisture and abrasive dirt that constantly threatened to jam its pristine action. This intense discipline ensured that when a fleeting target presented itself, the mechanical execution was flawlessly smooth, calculated, and instantly lethal. The fragile but highly effective Warner and Swayze telescopic sight proved absolutely invaluable in penetrating the gloomy, heavily shadowed depths of the forest. While German snipers largely relied on traditional iron sights that became virtually useless in low-light conditions, the American optic artificially gathered precious ambient light. This technological advantage allowed Hayes to easily distinguish the subtle grey field uniforms of the enemy infantrymen against the dark, muddy background of the dense woods. He could violently engage targets during the crucial twilight hours, extending his terrifying reign of psychological dominance long after standard combat operations had ceased. The cumulative psychological toll exacted upon the German infantrymen by these sudden, inexplicable casualties was far more devastating than traditional artillery barrages. The deeply ingrained terror of an invisible adversary, capable of delivering instantaneous death from impossible distances, slowly began to erode their fundamental combat discipline. Hardened veterans, who had previously charged directly into heavy machine gun fire, found themselves violently trembling at the simple command to traverse a small, open clearing. The mere physical presence of the American sniper had effectively paralyzed the tactical mobility of entire enemy companies, severely disrupting their defensive logistical operations. The Springfield also played a highly critical role in systematically dismantling the formidable German machine gun networks that anchored their defensive lines. These heavily fortified positions were specifically designed to withstand massive frontal assaults, featuring incredibly narrow firing slits that provided maximum frontal protection for the operators. However, the extreme, pinpoint accuracy of the American rifle allowed Hayes to casually thread his devastating .30-06 rounds directly through these tiny, fortified openings. He consistently eliminated the crucial gunners and their loaders with a terrifying, methodical rhythm, completely neutralizing the enemy's primary source of localized automated firepower. The intense horror of the situation was vividly highlighted during a desperate attempt by a German squad to retrieve water from a nearby stream. Convinced the deep twilight provided adequate visual cover, 4 soldiers sprinted rapidly toward the precious water source, located nearly 700 yards away. In a stunning display of mechanical mastery, Hayes rapidly cycled the smooth Springfield action, delivering 4 distinct, fatal shots in under 12 seconds. Another detail eliminated, he muttered coldly, observing the motionless bodies through his glass, proving that the enveloping darkness offered absolutely zero sanctuary from his calculated wrath. This terrifying, unrelenting efficiency heavily contributed to the fierce reputation of the United States Marines, whom the terrified Germans famously dubbed the Devil Dogs. While much of this legendary moniker stemmed from their aggressive frontal assaults, the sheer psychological devastation inflicted by their elite snipers was equally significant. The enemy simply could not comprehend the terrifying, cold-blooded precision required to consistently execute such impossible shots in an environment completely saturated with chaos. The Springfield rifle became intrinsically linked with this demonic mythology, viewed not merely as a standard weapon, but as a supernatural instrument of cursed destruction. Desperate to regain some semblance of tactical control, local German commanders aggressively deployed their own veteran sharpshooters to eliminate the invisible American threat. Armed with their highly reliable Mauser rifles, these experienced hunters carefully stalked the dense perimeter, desperately searching for the characteristic muzzle flash of the Springfield. However, Hayes was a master of profound concealment, meticulously utilizing the heavy shadows and natural acoustics of the deep forest to completely mask his firing positions. The German counter-snipers found themselves blindly hunting a ghost, often becoming tragic victims themselves when they inadvertently exposed their positions while searching. The extreme mathematical precision of Hayes's technique elevated his grim task from mere combat to a highly sophisticated, incredibly lethal form of applied physics. Every single shot required a complex, rapid calculation of barometric pressure, bullet drop, and the erratic, unpredictable wind currents swirling through the shattered trees. He possessed an innate, terrifying understanding of how the heavy .30-06 projectile would behave at maximum velocity, allowing him to consistently predict the exact point of catastrophic impact. This clinical, scientific approach completely stripped the humanity from his targets, reducing the enemy soldiers to mere mathematical variables needing immediate cancellation. The terrifying effectiveness of the Springfield 1903 forced the entire German military apparatus to fundamentally redefine their established parameters of a safe operational zone. The previously accepted threshold of 600 yards was violently extended to well over 900 yards, severely compressing their available logistical space. Vital communication trenches had to be laboriously deepened, and essential daylight resupply missions were entirely abandoned out of sheer, paralyzing fear of the American marksman. The weapon had essentially created an enormous, invisible barrier of death, effectively trapping the heavily armed German infantrymen within their own fortified defensive structures. This invisible barrier profoundly disrupted the daily survival routines of the common German soldier, turning every mundane task into a horrifying game of chance. Even using standard latrines located behind the secondary trench lines became a terrifying endeavor, as the incredibly flat trajectory of the Springfield offered no reliable cover. The constant, suffocating anxiety of being constantly watched by an executioner slowly deteriorated the physical and mental health of the frontline troops. The simple, mechanical action of a distant American rifle had effectively achieved what massive, prolonged artillery bombardments had consistently failed to accomplish: total psychological collapse. As the brutal weeks dragged on, the local German morale plummeted to critically low levels, severely alarming the highest echelons of their military command. The horrifying stories of the whispering death spread like a virulent plague through the ranks, heavily exaggerated by the terrified, exhausted survivors of the sniper attacks. They genuinely believed that the American weapon possessed a sinister, sentient intelligence, capable of deliberately seeking out officers and completely ignoring standard infantrymen. This widespread, paralyzing superstition severely undermined the strict authority of the German officers, who could no longer confidently guarantee the basic safety of their men. The dark mythology surrounding the weapon completely overshadowed its actual, physical mechanics, elevating the Springfield into a terrifying symbol of inevitable, inescapable doom. Soldiers began refusing direct orders to occupy specific forward observation posts, firmly convinced that those locations were mathematically cursed by the American demon. The intense psychological warfare waged by a handful of disciplined Marines, utilizing superior ballistic technology, was completely shattering the formidable resilience of the German army. The enemy was no longer simply fighting a physical war. They were desperately battling their own overwhelming, completely rational fear of the unseen predator. Despite his terrifying success, the incredibly harsh reality of this prolonged sniper campaign enacted a severe physical toll upon Corporal Hayes himself. The constant exposure to freezing rain, the debilitating lack of proper sleep, and the immense psychological pressure of maintaining absolute perfection slowly drained his stamina. He subsisted on meager rations, forcing his exhausted body to remain completely rigid for hours, while his sharp eyes obsessively scanned the desolate, grey horizon. Yet, his unwavering dedication to the lethal efficiency of his Springfield rifle kept him focused, continually pushing his physical limits to maintain absolute tactical dominance. The Imperial German High Command finally recognized that this localized crisis in Belleau Wood was severely threatening the structural integrity of their entire defensive line. The devastating loss of experienced officers and crucial artillery spotters was completely unacceptable, completely stalling their broader strategic initiatives in the hotly contested sector. They concluded that standard infantry tactics and massive artillery barrages were entirely useless against this highly specialized, surgical threat, hiding within the dense, shattered forest. A definitive, highly targeted solution was immediately required to completely eliminate the American sniper and permanently shatter the terrifying myth of the Springfield rifle. Orders were swiftly dispatched to the rear echelons, specifically requesting the immediate transfer of their most lethal asset, the renowned Unteroffizier, Erich Voss. Voss was a legendary, aristocratic marksman within the German ranks, boasting an unprecedented number of confirmed kills utilizing his highly customized Mauser-Gewehr 98. He was a cold, calculating predator who possessed an intimate, almost unnatural understanding of the intricate psychology and geometry of elite, long-range trench warfare. The German command firmly believed that only a master of Voss's exceptional caliber could successfully hunt and execute the terrifying phantom haunting the American lines. As Voss gathered his specialized equipment and prepared to enter the chaotic nightmare of Belleau Wood, a grim sense of anticipation settled over the trenches. The impending clash was no longer a mere skirmish. It was destined to be a horrifying battle of technological superiority and absolute psychological endurance. The flawless, devastating mechanics of the American Springfield 1903 were about to be severely tested against the vast experience and ruthless cunning of the German champion. The shattered, blood-soaked forest prepared to silently witness an agonizing, profoundly intimate duel, determining the true master of the gray zone. The fundamental nature of the conflict along the shattered Western Front underwent a profound, terrifying evolution, following the widespread deployment of the American marksman. It was no longer a conventional war defined solely by massive artillery bombardments or sweeping infantry charges across heavily fortified, muddy expanses. Instead, the brutal environment transformed into an agonizing, psychological siege where the primary weapon was not high explosives, but the suffocating, omnipresent fear of sudden assassination. The Springfield 1903 had effectively weaponized the very atmosphere, turning the previously mundane act of standing within a trench into an excruciatingly tense gamble with death. The foundational geometry of trench survival, meticulously calculated by German engineers over years of brutal stalemate, was completely obliterated by the American rifle. Previously established safe zones, located hundreds of yards behind the heavily fortified frontline perimeters, were abruptly transformed into highly lethal, inescapable execution boxes. Soldiers quickly realized that distance no longer offered any reliable protection against the flat, devastatingly accurate trajectory of the supersonic 3006 projectile, slicing through the cold air. The profound psychological shock of this sudden vulnerability shattered the foundational discipline of the deeply entrenched, battle-hardened Imperial German Army infantrymen holding the line. The absolute core of this paralyzing psychological terror stemmed from the horrifying physical mechanics of the supersonic American cartridge tearing across the desolate battlefield. Traveling at velocities far exceeding the speed of sound, the heavy projectile physically devastated its intended target long before any acoustic warning could arrive. A German infantryman would simply collapse, his skull violently fragmented, while his entirely oblivious comrades continued their conversations for a fraction of a heartbeat. Only then would the distant, mocking crack of the Springfield rifle echo across the mud, definitively confirming the presence of the invisible, lethal predator. This horrifying sequence of events systematically dismantled the basic sensory survival mechanisms that veteran soldiers heavily relied upon to navigate the deadly frontline environment. The terrifying realization that they could be abruptly erased from existence without ever hearing the fatal shot created a suffocating, deeply infectious atmosphere of extreme paranoia. The grim phenomenon was chillingly demonstrated when a veteran German sergeant, cautiously peering through a heavily armored periscope, was instantaneously killed by a perfectly placed round. The reinforced glass shattered violently into his eyes just a microsecond before the fatal bullet destroyed his brain, leaving his squad completely traumatized. The rampant, unyielding paranoia rapidly infected every single level of the exhausted German command structure stationed within the muddy, blood-soaked trenches of the sector. Sleep deprivation became a critical, widespread epidemic as terrified soldiers desperately kept watch, hallucinating the distinctive, threatening silhouette of an American sniper in every shadow. The constant, draining hypervigilance severely degraded their overall combat effectiveness, transforming highly disciplined, professional fighting units into heavily demoralized, deeply exhausted groups of frightened men. The sheer, overwhelming psychological weight of being continuously hunted by an unseen executioner proved far more destructive than standard, localized artillery bombardments. In the suffocating darkness of the muddy dugouts, the terrified German conscripts began weaving elaborate dark mythologies surrounding the invisible American marksmen hunting them. They spoke in trembling whispers of supernatural entities, demonic entities, armed with cursed weapons, capable of bending the very laws of physics and ballistics. The perfectly engineered Springfield rifle was no longer viewed as a standard piece of military hardware, but as a terrifying, unstoppable instrument of divine retribution. These rampant superstitions severely undermined the strict authority of the German officers, who entirely failed to logically explain the mathematically impossible distances of the fatal strikes. The physical manifestation of this extreme psychological collapse was absolutely devastating to the overall logistical operations of the deeply entrenched Imperial German forces. Frightened soldiers outright refused direct, lawful orders to occupy forward listening posts, firmly believing that stepping into those exposed positions guaranteed a sudden, violent death. The vital deployment of observation balloons, crucial for directing defensive artillery fire, was completely halted because the vulnerable operators were consistently, surgically eliminated during their ascent. The American snipers, utilizing the unparalleled accuracy of their formidable weapons, had effectively blinded the massive German military machine through the precise application of absolute terror. The simple, necessary act of exposing a single inch of a steel helmet above the trench parapet evolved into a paralyzing, widespread phobia among the troops. Desperate to locate the unseen American predator, German sentries frequently employed the classic trick of raising an empty helmet on a wooden stick to draw fire. However, the cold, mathematically precise American Marines recognized this basic deception instantly, utilizing the exceptionally clear optics of the Warner and Swayze sight to confirm the target. They would then deliberately fire a devastating round precisely through the absolute center of the decoy helmet, sending a terrifyingly clear psychological message. From his meticulously concealed position within the shattered landscape, Corporal Thomas Hayes coldly observed the catastrophic psychological breakdown of the opposing German forces. He completely understood that his grim primary objective was not merely to inflict physical casualties, but to systematically destroy the enemy's fundamental will to fight. Every deliberate, perfectly calculated pull of the Springfield's smooth trigger was meticulously designed to maximize the resulting terror among the surviving infantrymen huddled in the mud. He maintained a terrifying illusion of complete omnipresence, carefully shifting his firing positions to ensure the enemy constantly felt surrounded by invisible, lethal phantoms. Hayes approached his horrific task with an astonishing level of clinical, mathematical detachment, totally separating his human emotions from the devastating mechanics of long-range execution. He spent agonizing hours perfectly calculating complex variables, factoring the subtle shifts in barometric pressure, the erratic wind currents, and the devastating bullet drop. His trusty Springfield, 1903, was effectively transformed into a highly specialized instrument of psychological torture, surgically applying lethal pressure precisely where it caused the most profound panic. The cold, unfeeling nature of his lethal methodology stood in stark contrast to the emotional, chaotic devastation he continuously inflicted upon the enemy lines. The continuous, surgical application of extreme precision fire completely severed the crucial supply lines, sustaining the forward German positions located across the devastated battlefield. Daylight resupply missions, previously considered relatively routine, were entirely abandoned after multiple ration details were systematically annihilated by the impossibly accurate American fire. Heavily burdened soldiers, carrying essential food and drinking water, were ruthlessly targeted from distances exceeding 800 yards, their lifeless bodies left rotting in the open mud. The compounding horrors of extreme thirst and near starvation deeply exacerbated the terrifying psychological collapse of the desperately trapped infantrymen holding the forward trenches. The alarming statistical data reaching the highest echelons of the Imperial German High Command painted a remarkably grim picture of the deteriorating tactical situation. While massive artillery barrages reliably accounted for the vast majority of total combat casualties, the localized impact of the American snipers was disproportionately devastating to unit cohesion. Entire experienced battalions were effectively rendered completely combat ineffective not by overwhelming enemy numbers, but by the paralyzing psychological trauma inflicted by a handful of marksmen. The distinguished German generals quickly recognized that standard defensive tactics were absolutely useless against this highly specialized, technologically advanced form of targeted warfare. Recognizing the critical necessity to immediately neutralize this profound psychological threat, the desperate German commanders summoned Unteroffizier Erich Voss from a completely different sector. Voss, widely known among the troops as the Eagle, was a legendary aristocratic hunter holding an incredibly formidable reputation for ruthless efficiency and absolute coldness. Armed with his meticulously customized Mauser-Gewehr 98, he possessed a deep, highly analytical understanding of the intricate geometry and complex psychology governing elite sniper duels. His specialized deployment was specifically intended to permanently eliminate the terrifying American Phantom and critically restore the shattered morale of the terrified German infantrymen. Upon his quiet arrival at the devastated Belleau Wood sector, Voss immediately initiated a thorough, highly analytical investigation into the horrifying series of recent assassinations. He silently interviewed the deeply traumatized survivors, carefully noting the exact timing, the specific acoustic anomalies, and the horrifying physical descriptions of the catastrophic wounds inflicted. Surveying the vast, incredibly daunting distances between the shattered German lines and the suspected American positions, Voss quickly realized the terrible gravity of the escalating situation. He coldly concluded that he was not merely hunting a skilled soldier, but confronting a fundamentally superior, heavily optimized mechanical weapon system. Voss demanded to personally inspect the gruesome remains of a recently eliminated artillery spotter, meticulously examining the terrifying terminal ballistics of the 3006 cartridge. He closely observed the massive, catastrophic tissue damage, immediately recognizing that the heavy projectile had retained an immense amount of lethal kinetic energy across a tremendous distance. Furthermore, the incredibly precise, almost completely horizontal angle of the bullet's entry wound mathematically confirmed the horrifyingly flat trajectory of the highly advanced American ammunition. This grim forensic evidence unequivocally proved that the enemy possessed a distinct, frightening technological advantage in extreme long-range ballistic performance across the battlefield. Furthermore, Voss astutely deduced the critical existence of a highly advanced optical enhancement system utilized by the unseen American predator hiding in the dense forest. He logically reasoned that achieving such mathematically flawless target acquisition in the heavy, shifting shadows of the woods was absolutely impossible, utilizing standard iron sights. He understood that the American marksman possessed the terrifying ability to clearly pierce the gloom, effectively stripping away the natural visual cover the Germans desperately relied upon. This profound realization drastically altered Voss's tactical approach, forcing him to totally abandon traditional concealment methods and heavily rely on complete, absolute immobility. With his meticulous analysis completely finalized, the aristocratic German sniper began his extensive, highly calculated psychological and physical preparations for the impending lethal confrontation. He completely isolated himself from the surrounding panicked infantrymen, entering a deep state of cold, predatory focus necessary to effectively combat the invisible American threat. He carefully selected a highly unconventional, deeply shadowed firing position, specifically designed to completely mask the inevitable muzzle flash of his powerful Mauser rifle. The terrifying stage was finally set for an agonizing, profoundly silent battle of pure mechanical mastery, absolute patience, and unyielding psychological endurance across the desolation. The impending duel represented a fascinating, exceptionally deadly contrast between two vastly different cultures of military sharpshooting operating in the brutal European theater. On one side stood the aristocratic Voss, a product of deeply traditional European hunting lineages, heavily relying on vast personal experience and deeply ingrained instinct. Opposing him was Corporal Hayes, the cold embodiment of modern American industrial efficiency, utilizing superior optical technology and flawless mathematical calculations to deliver absolute death. It was a terrifying clash between the proven historical reliability of the Mauser action and the terrifying, highly advanced ballistic perfection of the Springfield 1903. As the grey, freezing dawn slowly illuminated the shattered remnants of the dense forest, an eerie, unnatural silence abruptly fell over the heavily contested sector. The exhausted German infantrymen intuitively sensed the profound shift in the atmosphere, desperately keeping their heads down as they realized the two apex predators were actively hunting. The previously continuous, chaotic background noise of distant artillery fire and sporadic machine gun bursts seemed to fade away, completely replaced by an agonizing, suffocating tension. The vast, deadly expanse of no man's land was completely transformed into a highly focused, terribly intimate arena of pure, unadulterated, lethal precision. Within the suffocating shadows of the ruined landscape, both master snipers remained perfectly motionless, fully prepared to exploit the absolute smallest mathematical or tactical error. The terrifying psychological warfare that had heavily plagued the German trenches had finally culminated in this highly anticipated, deeply personal confrontation between two deadly individuals. The flawlessly engineered Springfield 1903 rested silently in the hands of the American Marine, harboring its immense capacity for instant, devastating violence within its blued steel. The agonizing wait for the fatal, decisive moment began, promising a sudden, violently explosive conclusion to the terrifying reign of the invisible whispering death. The desolate, scarred expanse of no man's land transformed into an agonizingly intimate arena for two apex predators. The widespread chaos of standard trench warfare completely faded away, replaced by a suffocating, hyper-focused battle of wills. This was no longer a broad clash of massive European armies, but a microscopic, incredibly lethal game of cat and mouse. Corporal Hayes and Unteroffizier Voss fundamentally understood that mere survival entirely depended on absolute, unyielding perfection. The brutal environment demanded total submission to the grim realities of long-range execution, where any microscopic movement guaranteed instantaneous death. The physical reality of historical sniping was a grueling, unglamorous exercise in extreme human suffering and profound endurance. Hayes lay absolutely motionless in a shallow, waterlogged crater, surrounded by the rotting, putrid remnants of previous infantry charges. He completely blended his burlap-wrapped form into the freezing, toxic mud, essentially burying himself alive to achieve perfect visual camouflage. The horrific stench of decaying flesh and chemical residue filled his lungs, but his disciplined marine training heavily suppressed any natural physical revulsion. He existed solely as an emotionless, organic extension of his deadly weapon. Across the shattered, desolate terrain, the aristocratic German hunter meticulously established his own concealed firing position within a ruined tank. Voss carefully wedged his customized Mauser 98 between the jagged, rusted armor plates, creating an impenetrable, heavily shadowed fortress. He possessed an incredible wealth of combat experience, but this unprecedented duel against the technologically superior American rifle system felt terrifyingly different. The oppressive psychological weight of the Springfield's flat, supersonic trajectory constantly gnawed at his previously unshakable confidence. He knew the American marksman possessed the mathematical capability to instantly exploit the tiniest mistake. The stark contrast between their respective weapon systems heavily defined the agonizing tactical parameters of the prolonged confrontation. Voss wielded a legendary, deeply traditional rifle that required a masterful, instinctual understanding of pronounced bullet drop over vast distances. Conversely, Hayes commanded a highly advanced, flawlessly engineered marvel of modern industrial mechanics capable of maintaining a terrifyingly flat flight path. The devastating 3006 cartridge fundamentally eliminated the generous margin of error that the German sniper had historically relied upon to survive. It was a brutal clash between deeply ingrained intuition and cold, calculated ballistic science. The first grueling day of the agonizing duel passed without a single shot being fired across the devastated grey landscape. The immense psychological strain of maintaining absolute, unbroken vigilance, while completely paralyzed in the freezing mud, began to severely compound. Both men aggressively fought against the overwhelming, suffocating weight of sleep deprivation, utilizing every mental trick to remain consciously alert. Blinking became a heavily calculated risk, as closing their exhausted eyes for even a fraction of a second could invite sudden doom. The vast battlefield remained terrifyingly silent, holding its collective breath in anticipation. The severe physiological toll inflicted by such extreme, prolonged immobility was utterly devastating to the human body's basic functional systems. Severe muscle cramps viciously tore through Hayes's legs, screaming for basic relief, while profound dehydration thickened the blood in his veins. He strictly utilized his rigorous military conditioning to deliberately slow his natural heart rate, consciously minimizing his essential respiratory movements. Every single bodily function was forcefully suppressed, completely subordinated to the overriding, singular imperative of keeping the Springfield's crosshairs absolutely steady. The American sniper willingly endured this localized physical torture to guarantee mechanical perfection. Seeking to violently break the agonizing stalemate, Voss cautiously initiated a highly calculated, deeply deceptive psychological baiting tactic. He utilized a small, heavily scratched fragment of a shattered periscope mirror, intending to simulate the careless reflection of an optic. He slowly, deliberately angled the tiny shard to catch the weak ambient light, hoping to instantly draw the American's devastating fire. The German sniper patiently waited for the inevitable muzzle flash, his finger resting lightly upon the Mauser's deeply curved metal trigger. It was a deadly, sophisticated gamble designed to expose the invisible American phantom. From his heavily concealed, muddy vantage point, Hayes meticulously observed the faint, unnatural glimmer through his Warner and Swayze sight. He carefully analyzed the surrounding environmental context, mathematically calculating the exact angle of the weak sun and the surrounding shadows. Too low, too deliberate, he whispered coldly to himself, instantly recognizing the veteran deception deployed by his seasoned German adversary. He entirely refused to engage the false target, completely maintaining his strict, paralyzing discipline, despite the overwhelming temptation to strike. His mathematical patience proved vastly superior to the enemy's desperate attempt at psychological manipulation. The eventual arrival of the freezing night brought absolutely no physical relief to the exhausted combatants trapped in the wasteland. The plummeting temperatures aggressively attacked their immobile bodies, violently threatening to induce severe hypothermia before the morning sun could return. However, the suffocating darkness completely prevented any safe repositioning, as the heavily cratered terrain was saturated with hidden, deadly tripwires. They remained entirely frozen in their muddy tombs, relying purely on sheer, agonizing willpower to survive the brutally cold, nocturnal hours. The terrifying psychological war continued unabated beneath the indifferent, starry canopy of the European sky. As the second agonizing day dawned, the profound psychological breakdown of the standard infantryman observing the silent battlefield became evident. Both the American and German frontline trenches were gripped by an eerie, highly unnatural silence, as localized artillery fire completely ceased. The regular soldiers deeply understood that two legendary executioners were actively hunting, creating a terrifying, localized vacuum of extreme, concentrated violence. They practically held their collective breath, absolutely terrified that a single dropped mess tin might accidentally trigger the devastating conclusion. The profound psychological weight of the unseen duel heavily oppressed the entire shattered sector. The horrific reality of trench warfare manifested when a massive, diseased rat slowly crawled directly across Hayes's completely motionless face. The putrid vermin roughly scratched at his cheek, its filthy claws digging into his cold skin as it searched for food. The sheer, overwhelming instinct to violently flinch and brush the disgusting creature away screamed through his exhausted, heavily strained nervous system. Yet, he remained absolutely paralyzed, deeply understanding that any sudden, unnatural movement would instantly betray his perfect camouflage to Voss. The unyielding marine discipline completely overrode his basic human reflexes in the mud. Across the deadly divide, the crushing psychological pressure slowly began to erode the deeply ingrained aristocratic arrogance of the German. Voss had never previously encountered an adversary possessing such terrifying, seemingly endless reserves of cold, completely unfeeling mechanical patience. The terrifying reality of the Springfield's lethal, supersonic capability continually haunted his thoughts, severely degrading his normally flawless, analytical focus. He began to deeply question his own deeply established tactical parameters, wondering if the American possessed a supernatural field of vision. The invisible, crushing weight of the 1903 was slowly, methodically breaking the legendary hunter's spirit. The chaotic battlefield environment suddenly shifted as a freezing, miserable rain began to steadily fall across the ruined, grey landscape. The continuous downpour created a heavy, obscuring mist, severely complicating the already impossible task of maintaining clear, long-range optical visibility. Both men aggressively fought to protect their delicate glass lenses from the pervasive moisture, knowing a blurred sight meant sudden death. The erratic, swirling wind dramatically increased in velocity, introducing extremely volatile, highly unpredictable aerodynamic variables into the complex ballistic equation. The horrific weather conditions perfectly reflected the grim, escalating desperation of the agonizing, silent standoff. During the brutal deluge, Hayes meticulously shielded the flawlessly engineered action of his Springfield 1903 with his own freezing body. He deeply understood that a single, microscopic speck of abrasive mud could potentially cause a catastrophic mechanical malfunction during extraction. The absolute reliability of the weapon was entirely dependent on his obsessive, highly rigorous maintenance, even in the most atrocious conditions. He treated the polished steel and dark walnut with profound reverence, fully recognizing it as the solitary instrument guaranteeing his survival. His unyielding dedication ensured the lethal mechanical system remained perfectly primed for instantaneous execution. The definitive turning point of the agonizing confrontation finally arrived late on the third day, as the heavy clouds abruptly parted. A brilliantly intense shaft of setting sunlight violently pierced the gloomy atmosphere, instantly casting harsh, completely new shadows across the ruins. This sudden, dramatic shift in the ambient lighting rapidly altered the previously established visual baseline of the heavily scarred combat zone. It forced both exhausted marksmen to completely re-evaluate their meticulously chosen camouflage, desperately scanning the illuminated terrain for any newly exposed vulnerabilities. The climax of the psychological warfare was now measured in mere seconds. In that incredibly brief, highly volatile moment of shifting illumination, the legendary Unteroffizier Voss made a catastrophic, completely microscopic tactical error, desperately attempting to relieve a severe, agonizing cramp in his rigid shoulder. The German sniper shifted his position by mere millimeters. This infinitesimal, incredibly subtle movement inadvertently exposed the very edge of his Mauser's optical lens to the piercing, direct sunlight. A tiny, incredibly bright flash of brilliant golden reflection briefly sparked within the dark, rusted confines of his ruined tank fortress. That fleeting, microscopic failure of absolute discipline immediately sealed his grim, violent fate. From 800 yards away, the intensely focused American Marine instantly registered the unnatural, highly distinct glimmer through his own optic. The Warner and Swayze sights smoothly locked onto the precise origin of the lethal reflection, centering the thick, black crosshairs. Hayes's exhausted brain rapidly processed the final, highly complex mathematical calculations, instantly adjusting for the severe distance and the crosswind. Elevation holds, windage half-minute left. His mind clinically processed, completely stripping away any remaining trace of human emotion or fatigue. He had finally located the legendary German Eagle hiding within the shattered steel ruins. The final mechanical sequence of the execution was flawlessly executed, with terrifying, highly practiced precision and absolute, cold-blooded military discipline. Hayes slowly exhaled, completely emptying his burning lungs to forcibly stop the microscopic tremors heavily plaguing his exhausted, freezing body. His numb finger gently curled around the trigger, applying perfectly consistent, steadily increasing pressure until the weapon's breaking point was reached. The exceptionally smooth, flawless action of the Springfield 1903 functioned with absolute, beautiful, mechanical perfection, entirely validating its fearsome reputation. The deafening, concussive roar of the muzzle blast violently shattered the profound, agonizing silence of the battlefield. The devastating 3006 projectile violently erupted from the polished steel barrel, instantly achieving a terrifying, highly lethal supersonic atmospheric velocity. The aerodynamically perfect bullet sliced through the freezing, damp air, totally ignoring the chaotic crosswinds that would deflect a lesser round. It traveled the massive, desolate expanse of no man's land in a fraction of a second, completely outpacing its own acoustic signature. The terrifying, flat trajectory, heavily championed by the American engineers, was practically demonstrated as the bullet maintained its precise, mathematically determined flight path. It was an unstoppable, purely mechanical manifestation of absolute, guaranteed death. The flawless ballistic calculation culminated in a deeply horrific, instantaneous impact, precisely at the center of the brilliant optical reflection. The heavy American projectile violently smashed directly through the specialized glass lens of the German Mauser's telescopic sight, without deflecting. Retaining its immense, devastating kinetic energy, the bullet drove the shattered optical fragments instantly through Voss's aiming eye and into his brain. The aristocratic hunter was completely erased from existence long before the distant, mocking crack of the Springfield reached the ruined tank. His legendary career ended instantly, totally outmatched by superior mathematics and flawless mechanical execution. The sharp, echoing report of the American rifle slowly faded away, completely absorbed by the muddy, heavily saturated European landscape. Hayes remained absolutely motionless for several long, tense minutes, meticulously observing the distant, rusted target through his highly specialized optical sight. Seeing no further movement, he finally engaged the rifle's safety, cold satisfaction washing over his deeply exhausted, freezing physical form. The terrifying, technologically superior Springfield 1903 had completely dominated the greatest marksman the Imperial German Army could successfully deploy. The agonizing, psychological nightmare of the invisible whispering death had reached its ultimate, highly devastating mechanical conclusion. The deafening report of the American rifle slowly dissipated across the ruined landscape, leaving a profound, suffocating silence in its wake. Within the deeply entrenched German positions, an agonizing sense of dread steadily mounted as hours passed without any signal from their aristocratic champion. The local command structure nervously anticipated a triumphant return, completely unaware that their greatest marksman had been instantly erased from the battlefield. The terrifying, invisible American predator had successfully defended its dark territory, completely shattering the fragile hopes of the exhausted enemy infantrymen huddled in the freezing mud. Under the dense cover of total darkness, a highly specialized German recovery team cautiously crawled into the heavily cratered expanse of no man's land. They eventually reached the rusted, shattered remnants of the ruined tank, desperately hoping to find Unteroffizier Voss alive and victorious. Instead, they discovered a gruesome, highly demoralizing scene that perfectly illustrated the terrifying mechanical supremacy of the American weapon system. Their legendary hunter lay completely motionless within the twisted steel, his customized Mauser 98 resting uselessly beside his lifeless body, its intricate optical sight violently obliterated by the catastrophic impact. The terrified recovery team meticulously examined the horrific, highly specific nature of the fatal wound inflicted upon their esteemed sniper. They clearly observed that the devastating 3006 projectile had traveled exactly down the internal tube of the Mauser's telescopic sight. This terrifying forensic evidence mathematically proved that the American marksman had not simply fired blindly into the shadows, but had deliberately targeted the tiny, reflective, optical lens from nearly a mile away. The sheer, impossible precision of the fatal strike immediately sent violent shivers of pure terror down the spines of the veteran soldiers. As the grim, demoralizing news of Voss's violent demise rapidly spread through the freezing trenches, the local German morale completely collapsed. The exhausted, terrified conscripts realized that if their absolute best hunter could be effortlessly executed, then ordinary soldiers possessed entirely no chance of survival. The highly comforting illusion of safety that the German officers had desperately attempted to rebuild was permanently, violently shattered by a single, mathematically perfect American bullet. The deeply entrenched infantrymen were now hopelessly trapped in a suffocating psychological nightmare, entirely dominated by the terrifying legend of the whispering death. This profound psychological devastation immediately manifested in a complete, highly disruptive cessation of all standard German frontline combat activities. Terrified sentries entirely refused to utilize periscopes, firmly believing that the highly advanced American optics could magically detect their microscopic movements through the glass. Essential communication trenches were practically abandoned during daylight hours, severely crippling the fundamental logistical operations required to maintain the defensive perimeter. The terrifying, unseen presence of the Springfield 1903 had effectively paralyzed an entire military sector, utilizing extreme, surgical violence to achieve a massive strategic victory without launching a major offensive. Following the definitive, highly public elimination of their legendary champion, enemy sniper activity across the contested sector abruptly and completely ceased. The surviving German marksmen, deeply traumatized by the terrifying ballistic capabilities of the American weapon, absolutely refused to engage their invisible adversaries. They fully recognized that pulling a trigger would instantly expose their concealed positions to a retaliatory strike characterized by impossible, flawless, mechanical precision. The previously highly contested expanse of no man's land was now entirely controlled by the chilling, omnipresent threat of the flawlessly engineered Springfield 1903 resting in the shadows. Meanwhile, Corporal Thomas Hayes meticulously withdrew from his freezing, muddy firing position. His highly grim mission successfully accomplished with absolute perfection. The extreme, prolonged physical suffering he had willingly endured slowly caught up with his exhausted body, causing severe muscle tremors and profound fatigue. Yet, he carefully protected his heavily customized Springfield 1903 from the abrasive dirt, treating the deadly mechanical instrument with deep, almost religious reverence. He fully understood that this beautiful, flawlessly engineered piece of industrial machinery had directly guaranteed his survival during the most intensely terrifying psychological duel of his life. The brutal, highly publicized confrontation between the two apex predators served as the ultimate, definitive validation of the American weapon system. The Springfield 1903 had unequivocally proven its vast mechanical superiority over the deeply traditional, highly respected Mauser-Gewehr 98 in agonizing field conditions. The flawlessly smooth action, combined with the devastatingly flat trajectory of the 3006 cartridge, established a completely new, terrifyingly high standard for military sniper rifles. It practically demonstrated that advanced, highly calculated ballistic science could easily overcome decades of deeply ingrained hunting, intuition, and vast personal combat experience. The lasting, highly terrifying legacy of the 3006 cartridge was permanently cemented in the traumatized minds of the surviving enemy forces. Its incredible, supersonic velocity fundamentally altered the psychological reality of trench warfare, introducing the horrifying concept of instantaneous, totally silent death. The terrifying fact that the lethal projectile physically struck its target before the acoustic crack could be heard generated a widespread, deeply infectious paranoia. This unique, highly disturbing aerodynamic phenomenon effectively transformed the American sniper into a mythological entity, an invisible grim reaper harvesting souls without offering a single warning sound. The Imperial German High Command, severely disturbed by the comprehensive tactical paralysis occurring within the heavily contested Belleau Wood sector, drastically altered their established doctrines. They officially recognized that heavily fortified defensive positions were essentially useless against an adversary capable of executing key personnel through microscopic loopholes. The terrifying, localized dominance achieved by a handful of dedicated American Marines heavily forced the German military to permanently concede the psychological high ground. The mathematical perfection of the Springfield 1903 had successfully defeated the vast, heavily entrenched industrial military machine through the precise application of absolute terror. This profound, highly disruptive strategic shift completely elevated the specialized role of the modern military sniper from a minor nuisance to a deeply critical tactical asset. Historical military analysts carefully observed how the extreme, surgical lethality of the American weapon system severely degraded the operational efficiency of entire enemy battalions. Sniping was no longer viewed simply as a cruel method of random harassment, but as a highly sophisticated, deeply psychological weapon capable of breaking front lines, The terrifying legend of the Springfield 1903 heavily influenced the subsequent development of elite marksman programs across the globe. As the brutal, devastating conflict of the First World War slowly ground toward its inevitable conclusion, the American rifle continued its dark reign. Retreating German infantrymen continuously experienced the horrifying, sudden loss of their commanding officers to the invisible, flawless precision of the pursuing Marines. The deep, agonizing fear of the whispering death aggressively haunted the exhausted enemy ranks, severely hampering their desperate attempts to establish organized rearguard defensive lines. The perfectly engineered weapon heavily dictated the tragic, bloody tempo of the final military engagements, relentlessly punishing any careless exposure with instantaneous, violent execution. Long after the final, deafening artillery barrages had completely ceased, and the muddy trenches were abandoned, the dark mythology endured. Highly traumatized German veterans returned home, deeply scarred by the terrifying memories of the supersonic projectiles, silently ending the lives of their closest comrades. They consistently recounted horrifying stories of the invisible American demon wielding a perfectly engineered weapon that completely defied the natural laws of ballistics. The agonizing, psychological nightmare inflicted by the Springfield 1903 remained a highly prominent, deeply disturbing fixture in their collective consciousness for the rest of their natural lives. The flawlessly engineered Springfield 1903 officially transcended its physical components of blued steel and polished walnut, becoming a terrifying historical legend. It effectively symbolized a drastic, highly lethal evolution in modern military technology, where extreme, calculated precision violently replaced massive, chaotic industrial slaughter. The beautiful, intricate mechanical action was universally recognized as a masterpiece of lethal engineering, specifically designed to flawlessly execute complex mathematical equations across vast, deadly distances. The weapon's terrifying reputation for absolute, guaranteed destruction firmly cemented its dark legacy as the ultimate, inescapable widowmaker of the bloody 20th century. The rigorous, highly demanding training doctrines originally developed by the United States Marine Corps specifically for the Springfield rifle became the ultimate gold standard. The extreme emphasis on absolute, paralyzing immobility, complex atmospheric calculations, and flawless trigger control heavily defined the modern understanding of elite long-range combat. Military institutions worldwide meticulously studied the terrifying, highly documented success of the American marksman, desperately seeking to replicate their devastating psychological effectiveness. The intense, highly scientific methodology utilized to successfully operate the 1903 completely revolutionized the grim, deadly art of specialized infantry warfare for future generations. As the world slowly transitioned into a fragile, deeply uneasy interwar period, the dark legend of the American sniper weapon system continued to heavily influence global military philosophy. The terrifying, well-documented accounts of extreme surgical decapitation strike significantly, forced international engineers to rethink standard infantry engagement distances and required optical enhancements. The beautiful, highly reliable Mauser action, heavily refined and perfected by American industrial ingenuity, remained the absolute baseline for all future precision bolt-action rifles. The terrifying, undeniable truth of its extreme lethality could not be ignored by any nation preparing for inevitable future conflicts. The specific, highly disturbing acoustic phenomenon of the supersonic 3006 cartridge remained the most deeply feared characteristic of the legendary weapon. The terrifying fact that the victim died entirely in silence, followed by the mocking, distant crack of the rifle, became a staple of grim sniper lore. This horrific sensory disconnect was meticulously analyzed by military psychologists, who firmly concluded that it generated an unprecedented, highly infectious level of paralyzing battlefield terror. The Springfield had successfully weaponized the basic speed of sound, utilizing extreme velocity to systematically destroy the enemy's fundamental psychological stability. The grueling, highly agonizing duel in the shattered remnants of Belleau Wood stood as the ultimate historical testament to the weapon's dark supremacy. Corporal Hayes's flawless, mathematically perfect execution of the legendary German champion practically demonstrated the terrifying, inescapable reality of advanced ballistic science. The The microscopic margin of error, allowed by the perfectly engineered American rifle, guaranteed that the absolute smallest human mistake resulted in immediate, violent death. This deeply horrific, highly intimate confrontation perfectly encapsulated the brutal, terrifyingly precise nature of modern long-range combat, heavily pioneered by the United States Marines. Ultimately, the dark, enduring legacy of the Springfield 1903 was not merely defined by its high number of confirmed enemy casualties. Instead, its terrifying historical footprint was heavily measured by the massive, widespread psychological devastation it continuously inflicted upon deeply entrenched, battle-hardened armies. It effectively taught the world that a single, heavily trained individual, armed with a mathematically perfect machine, could easily paralyze thousands of enemy troops. The perfectly engineered rifle remains a dark, chilling monument to the terrifying, uncompromising lethality of highly advanced military industrialization applied to human conflict. The terrifying, invisible whispering death forever altered the foundational, deeply psychological parameters of infantry warfare, introducing an agonizing, entirely new dimension of battlefield terror. The flawlessly smooth bolt action, the massive kinetic energy, and the incredibly flat trajectory perfectly combined to create an absolutely unstoppable mechanical predator. Enemy snipers learned to deeply fear the very shadows, fundamentally understanding that the American weapon system offered entirely zero sanctuary across the desolate wasteland. The Springfield 1903 flawlessly earned its dark, horrifying reputation in blood, forever remaining the undisputed, terrifying master of the muddy, blood-soaked trenches. The historical preservation of the Springfield 1903 in various modern military museums serves as a chilling, highly tangible reminder of this brutal, terrifying era. Examining the heavy, blued steel barrel and the beautifully polished walnut stock, one can easily imagine the immense, terrifying power held within its mechanisms. It stands as a solemn, deeply sobering artifact of a time when mathematical precision and advanced industrial engineering were successfully utilized to maximize human suffering. The perfectly preserved weapon silently echoes the agonizing, horrific stories of the invisible executioners who aggressively dominated the vast, shattered European battlefields. In the final, objective analysis by professional military historians, the deeply dark reasons behind the extreme enemy fear were entirely justified by the weapon's performance. The Springfield 1903 did not simply defeat the highly experienced German snipers. It systematically, violently dismantled their fundamental psychological capacity to wage war. The terrifying, perfectly engineered combination of extreme accuracy, supersonic velocity, and flawless mechanical reliability successfully birthed an entirely new echelon of specialized military lethality. It remains a legendary, highly terrifying icon of early modern combat, forever representing the ultimate, inescapable triumph of cold, calculated ballistic perfection.